doing the grey and white matter of the cerebrum, now we switch on to the cavity of the cerebrum, that is called the lateral ventricle. As we know, every part of the brain is hollow from inside and it is filled with the CSF. Similarly, the forebrain that is formed by the cerebrum and the diencephalon, they are also hollow from inside. And this hollow cavity is called the ventricle. In order to understand the lateral ventricle, first of all we have to go in the developmental stage. During the development of the cerebrum, the lateral ventricle was very large. As we cut the early stage of the development of the cerebrum, it is formed by the cerebral cortex at the periphery, and centrally there was a large cavity, that is the lateral ventricle. So this was the grey matter. This is called the cerebral cortex because it was only at the periphery. In this stage, there was no development of the basal ganglia or the hippocampus and other grey matter. And whole of this inside of the developing cerebrum, it was lined by the ependyma. This is the ependyma, separating the CSF from the cerebral cortex, the grey matter. This is the ependyma. And this hole is filled with the CSF. So it is in the primitive stage of the development of the lateral ventricle, was very large. Now we consider our hand is like the cerebral hemisphere. So this hole is the grey matter, that is the peripheral part, the cerebral cortex. And inside this whole cavity is empty, that is the lateral ventricle, right and left two cerebral hemisphere, and two cavities are there. Now it is filled with the CSF. Now put the CSF and fill the lateral ventricle. When we put in the anatomical position, the CSF will come out. Now what we do? Put the CSF and put a sellotape. Now put in the anatomical position. Now the CSF won't come out because sellotape is there. So this sellotape is actually septum pellucidum. So this is the septum pellucidum. So septum pellucidum was very large in size, as large as the large lateral ventricle cavity. But after the development of the basal ganglia, after the development of the hippocampus, after the development of the corpus callosum, now this lateral ventricle shrink. And its shape changes. But in the primitive stage also, the cavity was in the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital, and as well as the temporal lobe. So every lobe is having the lateral ventricle. Even after the development of the grey matter, every lobe of 4 lobes of the cerebrum contains lateral ventricle, part of lateral ventricle, and accordingly we name them. So before we going into the detail of the 4 parts of the lateral ventricle lying in the 4 lobes of the cerebrum, a little bit we have to go through the developmental phase of the cerebral gray matter and white matter also. Now this is the large septum pellucidum. So what happens to the large lateral ventricle into small one? Just we have to elaborate. A second diagram. This is the cerebral cortex. So this is the medial surface of the cerebrum. And this is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and below the jugular. Now what happens? There is the development of the various structures. As we have done the gray matter of the cerebrum and white matter of the cerebrum also. So many things develops. For example, there develops egg shape. We have done in the basal ganglia also a egg shaped thalamus. And superolateral to it lies the caudate nucleus. Anteriorly the head, then the body, and the tail, which is having in close contact with the thalamus, as we have done the basal ganglia. So caudate nucleus, the head, body and tail, they are intimately in relation to the thalamus, but it lies superolateral to the thalamus. And at the tip of the tail of the caudate nucleus, here lies the, we have done also the amygdaloid nucleus, the basal ganglia. We have covered it. So we have to again focus on the same diagram as we have discussed in the gray matter of the cerebrum. So this is the caudate nucleus and this is the thalamus. Then in the floor or in the temporal lobe, later on, as we know, there develops more medially placed pes and hippocampus and dentate gyrus. And this is the parahippocampal gyrus. So this is the gray matter of the cerebrum. They develop later on. Then, so the basal ganglia develops like this on the right side as well as the left side of the cerebral hemisphere. After this development, now the corpus callosum develops, the white matter bundle, which joins the two cerebral hemispheres. So, after the development of the white matter, how it looks like? This is the horizontal part of the corpus callosum, that is called the rostrum. Then rostrum bends up. This bending of the corpus callosum anteriorly in the frontal lobe is called the genu, means the bend. Then it runs upward and backward, and posteriorly ends into the splenium and from the body or the trunk. So this is the corpus callosum develops later on with the rostrum horizontal part, then the bent genu, then the trunk or the body, and the posterior free end is the splenium. So these are the developmental phases when the great white matter is developing in this cerebrum. So this diagram is very, very important to understand the four parts of the lateral ventricle. Then we have done from the dentate gyrus, parahippocampal and the hippocampus, we have developed the alveus, the white matter comes. And this all white matter collected medially on the hippocampus to form the what is called fimbria of the fornix. And this fornix, as we trace it backward, it becomes the crus of the fornix. The right and left crus, they meet below the splenium of the corpus callosum as the body of the corpus callosum, body of the fornix. And this body of the fornix runs below the body of the corpus callosum. And anteriorly is split into two columns of the fornix. Two columns of the fornix. So this is the white matter, the fimbria, the crus, and this is the body of the fornix. And then anteriorly the columns, which end into mammillary bodies. So this structure later develops later on. And there is a gap between the thalamus and the fornix. That is called the choroid fissure. So this is the developmental phases of the cerebrum from primitive stage to the developmental stage. So you have to compare. So the septum pellucidum, which was very large in size, because of the development of the grey and white matter of the cerebrum, it is diminished to a small extent, to a small size. And it is only confined below in relation to the rostrum, genu and the anterior part of the trunk. So this is I am making the septum pellucidum. So this is the septum pellucidum. The last septum pellucidum has shrunk to the small size of this much. So this is the septum pellucidum after the development, and this is the last septum pellucidum. So that is the effect of the developmental phase of the grey and white matter of the cerebrum, which has made the septum pellucidum a small size. So here the septum pellucidum attachment, if you want to know, superiorly and anteriorly and inferiorly are attached to the rostrum, genu and the anterior part of the trunk of the corpus callosum. And inferiorly it is attached to the column of the fornix. So that is the attachment of septum pellucidum. So the septum pellucidum is medial most structure in the frontal lobe, and it contains grey and white matter. It is made up of grey and white matter sheet. The nuclei in the septum pellucidum, the function of this septal nuclei or the nuclei grey matter of the septum pellucidum, the function is player. So P for pellucidum, remember P for player. So these player mood of the humans, they are related to the nuclei of the septum pellucidum, or also called septal nuclei. And rostrum below is continuous with the lamina terminalis. So this is the effect of the development, which has shrink the size of the lateral ventricle. So lateral ventricle, which was very large, if we see here, it becomes horseshoe shape. Horseshoe shape. So this becomes C-shaped structure and extend posteriorly in the occipital. So that is the effect. Or we can make this large size of the lateral ventricle after the development assume this shape. So it resembles the alphabetical S. And according to its position in different parts, we name it. So the part of the lateral ventricle which comes in the frontal lobe is called the anterior horn. The part which comes into the posterior horn for the occipital lobe is called the posterior horn. This is the parieto-occipital sulcus. This is the calcarine sulcus. So this part of the lateral ventricle which has come into the occipital lobe is called the posterior horn. And the part which extends and comes into the temporal lobe It is called the inferior horn. In the temporal, the lateral ventricle is called inferior horn because it lies inferior. And whichever part is left, which lies in the parietal lobe, is called the central part of the lateral ventricle. So lateral ventricle is divided into four parts into four lobes, as the anterior horn, central part, posterior horn, and the inferior horn. So all are present. The anterior horn, in the frontal lobe, in the parietal lobe, the central part, and in the occipital lobe, the posterior horn. And the meeting place of the central part, posterior horn and inferior horn is called the trigone area. So it is the triangular area. It is called the trigone area of the lateral ventricle. So now, after this development into the four horns of the lateral ventricle, we will go systematically, one by one, to explain the different parts of the lateral ventricle. First of all, we will take the anterior horn. So anterior horn is lying in the frontal lobe. So whenever we have to explain any part of the lateral ventricle, you minimize yourself in such a way. For example, you want to explain the anterior horn. So consider that you are standing in the anterior horn. So you are in a room. So anterior horn is a room in which you are standing. Your feet are touching the floor. Your head is seeing the roof. Your front portion is the anterior extent, and your back side is telling the posterior extension or the posterior part of the lateral ventricle. If you put your right hand, then your right hand goes to the lateral wall, and your left hand is touching the medial wall of the lateral ventricle. So this is the most suitable and the simplified method to understand the boundaries of any horn or any part of the lateral ventricle. You minimize yourself and you will stand inside the, for example, you want to explain the inferior horn. Go into the inferior horn, stand there, and you describe the anterior, posterior, roof, floor, lateral, medial. You want to go in the posterior horn, go inside, stand there, and explain the roof, floor, anterior, posterior. Similarly, if you want to the central part, you stand in the central part, and you explain the roof, floor, lateral, medial wall, and whatever. So this is the how you have to explain. All boundaries will be crystal clear. If you know this diagram, it's very helpful to understand any horn, any part of the lateral ventricle. And second method is, you minimize yourself. You stand inside the ventricle and describe like the lecture theatre. I am standing in the lecture theatre, that is the roof. Below my feet is the floor. This is the lateral wall. This is the medial wall. This is is the posterior wall, and this is the anterior wall. So it is a three-dimensional picture of the lateral ventricle. So any horn can be explained on this side. Second thing, whenever you have to explain any part of the lateral ventricle, any horn, the second picture, one is this medial aspect. This is sagittal section of the cerebrum or the corpus callosum, showing the medial surface of the cerebrum. Another thing you have to consider is the coronal section of the cerebrum. That like this you have to cut. So one is the coronal, that is sagittal section, other is the coronal section in the anterior horn, the central part, inferior horn, and the posterior. So the two diagrams, one is the medial and another is the, one is the sagittal, other is the coronal section, will explain the boundaries of the lateral ventricle. So this is the basics. Another thing you have to understand on the medial surface is that I have told you already that there is a gap between the thalamus and the fornix, and this gap is also C-shaped. It encircles around the thalamus and the fimbria, the crus, and the body of the fornix. So this C-shaped structure, a C-shaped gap which is present so on the medial surface of the cerebrum is called the choroid fissure. Is the choroid fissure. So in order to understand the choroid fissure, it is C-shaped. It doesn't extend into the anterior horn. It is present in the central part, it is present in the inferior horn. It doesn't extend into the posterior horn as well as the anterior horn. It is only confined to the central part and the inferior horn of it. In order to understand it properly, we have to cut the coronal section of the central part of the cerebrum. So when we cut the coronal section, as well as the coronal section of this, posterior horn is also cut by it. So we have to make two diagrams. One is the medial aspect, other is the coronal section of the horn. So when we cut this, the coronal section, how we can explain it? The sections of the more simplified way to understand the geometry and conception of the, for example, the central part of the lateral ventricle, to understand what is the choroid fissure. So this is the cut, start from here and the cut ends here. So when we cut here, first what we have cut, we make this is the cut, the lateral part of the cerebrum. So here is cut. After that, from this point to this point is this. Then from this point to this corpus callosum, the upper surface. So from here is the upper surface. So here is only the grey matter. Then from this to this, we can show the cut section, the corpus callosum. The lateralmost fibers, they are the tapetum. They are the tapetum. The corpus callosum is cut in the coronal section, looks like this. Corpus callosum. So this is from this point to this point. This point is equivalent to this and this point. Then just below the corpus callosum, what is touching? The body of the fornix. Just below here is the body of the fornix. Then from this point to this point, that is the thalamus. The thalamus is cut like this. So there is a gap between the fornix and the dorsal surface of the superior surface of the thalamus, and this gap is called the choroid fissure. So this is the gap between the fornix and the thalamus, and the pyometer covers the medial surface of the cerebrum. The pyometer, and as it comes here below the corpus callosum and between the fornix and the dorsal surface of the thalamus, so it goes inside, and then it reverses back, covering the superior lateral surface of the cerebrum of the thalamus, and again comes out and covers the medial surface of cerebrum of the thalamus. So this double fold of the pyometer is going inside and coming out from the same choroid fissure. So fissure is a small gap above in the fornix and below by the thalamus. In the central section it is C-shaped, but here in the coronal section it is slit-like, through which the pyometer is entering. And through this C-shaped choroid fissure, there enters the anterior cerebral artery branches, which goes inside the choroid fissure, and here it divides into the multiple capillary network. A bunch of capillary from the anterior choroidal artery, which is a branch of the middle cerebral artery. A bunch of capillaries formed here inside as it goes from the median to the lateral side. So this tuft of the capillaries is called the choroid plexus. Plexus means a network, a meshwork of capillary. And this meshwork of the capillary is equivalent to the glomerulus of your kidney. As glomerulus of kidneys consist of the afferent arteriole and the efferent arteriole, which form the bunch of capillaries, the glomerulus. The blood comes here, afferent and efferent, it goes like this. So similarly, the blood from the anterior choroidal artery forms the blood inside. And as in the kidney, below is the Bowman's capsule, in which the urinary filtrate comes. In the same way, here what happens, that the pyometer is touched by a single layer of the what is called ependyma. Ependyma, as we have done, is the inner lining of the lateral ventricle. Whole of the lateral ventricle, even after the development, to diminish to C-shape, like the horn of the sheep of the goat, it is still lined by the ependyma, which separates the CSF to the grey and white matter. So this complex is so formed is equivalent to the nephron of the kidney. As the urinary filtrate comes out of the glomerulus and it is filled in the cup formed by the Bowman's capsule, that is the collecting tubule system. In the same way, the choroid plexus will form the CSF. So manufacturing of the CSF occurs here, and this CSF comes through the pyometer and the ependyma, and it is collected here in the lateral ventricle. So this is CSF. So here is the filtration. Urinary filtrate is formed in the Bowman's capsule, and here CSF is formed in the lateral ventricle. So it is almost equal thing. Now here it is the excretion, but here it is the CSF is a secretion. It is a useful thing. It gives nutrition to the gray and white matter of the central nervous system, the brain as well as the spinal cord. It nourishes the tissues, the neurons. That's why we say it is a secretion. So this is how this. So in the kidney we call it as the nephron, but in the brain, what we call this complex? We use the word choroidia. It is the choroidia. So choroidia consists of number 1, double fold of the pia mater. Number 2, choroid plexus. Number 3 is the ependyma. So this whole complex is called the choroidia. So choroidia is the largest manufacturing place of the CSF in the lateral ventricle, and because the choroid fissure is also C-shaped, so the choroidia is also choroid fissure, choroid plexus is also C-shaped. So this is how we make the choroid plexus. It is C-shaped. And anteriorly it extends into the foramen of Monro. And this interventricular foramen of Monro is present anterior to the thalamus, but posterior to the column of the fornix. So the choroid plexus extends into the third ventricle through this interventricular foramen of the Monro, which is situated here. So this is the choroid plexus. Now wherever the artery goes, we know the vein comes out. So from the same choroid plexus, the artery is going inside anterior choroidal artery, and what comes out? The choroidal vein. Choroidal vein comes out. And here all the choroidal veins comes out of the choroid plexus. They all gather here between the choroid nucleus and the dorsal surface of the thalamus. They form a vein, and it also brings the venous blood out of the choroid nucleus and out of the thalamus also, and out of the choroid plexus. So this whole venous drainage system which runs along the C-shaped choroid plexus is called the thalamostriate vein. This is thalamostriate vein. So this thalamostriate is the venous drainage of the thalamo means from thalamus, and striate means corpus striatum, that is the basal ganglia, that is the lentiform nucleus, and the choroid nucleus. So venous drainage from this also comes out. And this thalamostriate vein, it lies between the choroid nucleus and the thalamus. And the thalamostriate veins of the right and left side, it unite with the internal cerebral vein, which brings the venous blood from the deeper part of the cerebrum, and both unite to form the great cerebral vein. So internal cerebral vein and the thermostat vein, both together, they form the great cerebral vein, and this great cerebral vein leaves the cerebrum just below the splenium, and this great cerebral vein, then it will unite with the inferior sagittal sinus, which lies at the lower border of the falx cerebri, which is hanging above the superior or the dorsal surface of the corpus callosum. So this inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral vein both unite to form what is called the straight sinus. And the straight sinus then meet with the superior sagittal sinus. Where the straight sinus opens into the right and left superior sagittal sinus, which inversely goes into the transverse sinus. So this is called the this place is called the confluence of the sinuses, and this transverse sinus then opens into the S-shaped sigmoid sinus in the posterior cranial fossa of the skull, and this sigmoid sinus then reaches the posterior part of the jugular foramen as a superior bulb, and then it leaves the skull through the posterior part of the jugular foramen as the internal jugular vein. So this is how the venous drainage of the and arterial supply of the oral plexus, they are related together. So this is the basic diagram which we will do later on by explaining the different part of the lateral ventricle. That's all.